If someone you've trusted for half your life asks to stay with you for exactly 1 week and refuses to explain why, you only have two choices. You can ask questions, or you can let the silence tell its own story. I chose the silence. It was a rainy Tuesday evening in early October when my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen lighting up my screen in almost 8 months. Noah Bennett. My best friend since freshman year of college. The guy who knew every embarrassing story I'd ever tried to forget, every dream I'd almost given up on, and every apartment I'd ever called home. We used to talk every day. Then life happened the way it always does. Deadlines replaced conversations. Different cities replaced late-night diners. Holidays became rushed text messages instead of long weekends together. Seeing his name again felt strangely familiar, like hearing a favorite song you didn't realize you'd missed. I answered on the second ring. Hey. His voice sounded softer than I remembered. Calm, but tired. Hey yourself. I laughed. You still alive? There was a brief pause before he spoke again. Ethan, can I ask you for a favor? Sure. Another pause. Longer this time. Can I stay with you for a week? I leaned back against my kitchen counter, looking out the apartment window at the rain sliding down the glass. A week. Just 7 days. What's going on? More silence. Then a quiet answer. I'll explain later. I just need somewhere safe to think. Safe. That word stayed with me. Noah wasn't the kind of person who asked for help. During college, he'd worked 2 jobs without complaining. When his car died in the middle of winter, he'd walked 3 miles home instead of calling anyone. Pride wasn't just part of his personality. It was stitched into him. If he was asking now, something had to be different. You don't have to explain, I finally said. Come over. Thank you. When? I'm already outside. I blinked. Outside. I walked toward the front door, unlocked it, and there he was. One small navy suitcase stood beside him. A worn canvas backpack rested over one shoulder. His dark brown hair was damp from the rain, and the familiar crooked smile appeared. For just a second before fading again. He looked almost exactly the same as the last time I'd seen him, except for one thing I couldn't quite name. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't sadness. It was as if he had already said goodbye to something important before knocking on my door. You drove all the way here without calling first. I asked. I wasn't sure I'd have the courage if I waited. I stepped aside. You know you're always welcome. He thanked me again, almost too quickly, before rolling his suitcase inside. My apartment wasn't large. 1 bedroom, a tiny office I barely used, and a living room just big enough for an old gray couch and a coffee table scarred by years of takeout dinners and unfinished design sketches. Noah looked around as though he were memorizing every detail. Still keeping plants alive? He asked, noticing the collection by the window. Barely. They're doing better than my last apartment. We both laughed, and for one brief moment, everything felt normal again. But later that night, after I'd made us grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup the way we used to eat during finals week, I noticed something strange. Noah kept glancing toward the small wooden box he had placed carefully beside his suitcase. He never opened it. He never let it leave his sight. And every time I almost asked about it, he quietly changed the subject, as though whatever waited inside that box mattered more than anything he was ready to say. The next morning began with the familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee and the quiet tapping of rain against my living room window. I expected to wake up before Noah, but when I stepped into the kitchen, he was already there wearing one of my old college sweatshirts that I had tossed onto the guest bed the night before. He stood by the stove making scrambled eggs with the same calm concentration he used years ago whenever we shared apartments during summer internships. For a second, it felt as though time had folded in on itself. You still overcook them, I teased. He smiled without looking at me. You still complain before tasting them. We laughed, and the sound filled the apartment with something I had not realized I had been missing. Breakfast turned into an easy conversation about work, old classmates, and a baseball game we had both watched months apart. Everything sounded normal. Too normal. Noah carefully answered every simple question, but somehow avoided every meaningful one. Whenever I asked about where he had been living or what had brought him across 3 states with only a suitcase, he redirected the conversation with another question about my interior design projects or the neighborhood coffee shop down the street. It was subtle enough that someone else might not have noticed. I noticed because I had spent years learning the rhythm of his silence. Later that afternoon, I worked from my home office while Noah wandered through the apartment carrying his camera. Every so often, I heard the quiet click of the shutter. He photographed the bookshelf in the corner, the sunlight reflecting off the kitchen sink after the rain finally stopped, the little plant growing beside the window, and even the cracked ceramic mug I refused to throw away because he had given it to me on my 21st birthday. "Why are you taking pictures of ordinary things?" I asked. He lowered the camera with a thoughtful expression. "Sometimes ordinary things disappear before you realize they mattered." The answer lingered in the room long after he walked away. That evening, we decided to walk to the neighborhood grocery store instead of ordering dinner. The air smelled fresh after the storm, and the sidewalks shimmered beneath the streetlights. People passed us with shopping bags and dogs tugging happily on their leashes. Noah kept slowing down to notice little things I usually ignored. A musician playing an old guitar outside the subway entrance, a child chasing bubbles across the park, an elderly couple holding hands while sharing a paper cup of hot chocolate. It was as though he wanted to memorize every ordinary moment the world had to offer. On the walk home, my phone rang. It was a client calling about changes to a restaurant renovation. I stepped a few feet away to answer, and when I returned less than 5 minutes later, Noah was staring quietly across the street at nothing in particular. His expression changed the instant he noticed me watching. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yes," he answered almost immediately. Too quickly. Back at the apartment, he disappeared into the guest room earlier than expected. As I walked past the half-open door to say goodnight, I caught a glimpse of him sitting on the edge of the bed with the small wooden box resting in his lap. His fingers traced the worn edges as though it contained something impossibly fragile. He looked at it for a long time, but never lifted the lid. Then, with a slow breath, he placed it back beside the suitcase, switched off the lamp, and sat alone in the darkness, unaware that I was beginning to realize his week with me was not about finding a place to stay. It was about finding the courage to face something he had carried for far longer than 7 days. By the third day, I realized Noah had settled into my apartment with surprising ease, yet there was an invisible wall he never allowed either of us to cross. Every morning he woke before sunrise, made coffee for both of us, watered my plants without being asked, and left the guest room so neat it looked untouched. If someone had walked in, they would have thought he planned to stay for months instead of only 1 week. But every evening followed the same quiet ritual. After dinner, he disappeared into the guest room, closed the door almost all the way, and spent hours alone. I never heard music. I never heard television. Sometimes I heard the faint rustle of paper, followed by complete silence. Once or twice I caught him whispering to himself so softly that I could not make out a single word. I tried to convince myself everyone deserved privacy. Yet curiosity has a strange way of growing inside ordinary moments. That afternoon, I finished work earlier than expected and suggested we drive out to the lake where we used to spend weekends during college. Noah hesitated just long enough for me to notice before forcing a smile. "Sure," he said. "I would like that." The drive took about 40 minutes. The trees had already begun changing color, painting the hills with deep reds and bright golds that reflected across the calm water. We walked the same trail we had wandered countless times years ago, passing the old wooden dock where we once argued for an hour about whether either of us would still be living in this state by the time we turned 30. Back then, we had believed life would be simple. Careers, relationships, houses, maybe a dog or two. Reality had written a different story for both of us. Noah carried his camera as always, but instead of photographing the landscape, he kept turning the lens toward me. "Do not move," he said with a quiet grin. "The light is perfect." I laughed. "Since when am I more interesting than the lake?" "Since always," he answered before looking away almost immediately. The words slipped out so naturally that I wondered if he even realized he had spoken them. On the drive home, neither of us said much. The comfortable silence that had once defined our friendship now felt heavier, as though every mile carried an unspoken sentence waiting to be finished. That night, I woke around 2 in the morning after hearing footsteps in the hallway. I found Noah standing beside the living room window, looking out over the empty street below. Moonlight spilled across the floor, outlining his figure against the glass. "You cannot sleep?" I asked quietly. He startled slightly before offering a tired smile. "I did not mean to wake you. Everything all right?" He nodded without taking his eyes off the window. "Just thinking." "About what?" He let out a slow breath. Have you ever waited so long to tell someone the truth that eventually you convinced yourself it was too late? The question caught me off guard. Before I could answer, his phone vibrated on the windowsill. The screen lit up with an incoming call, but instead of answering, he stared at the name until the ringing stopped. A second later, he switched the phone completely off, slipped it into his pocket, and quietly walked back toward the guest room. As he passed me, I noticed something I had not seen before. Folded carefully beneath his arm was a faded envelope with my name written across the front in handwriting I recognized instantly. It was Noah's. The paper looked old, the edges softened by time, as though it had been carried for years without ever reaching the person it was meant for. The next morning, I could not stop thinking about the envelope with my name on it. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe it was an old birthday card he had forgotten to give me. Maybe it was a letter he had started writing years ago and never finished. Whatever it was, Noah clearly was not ready for me to see it. And after knowing him for almost a decade, I understood that pushing him would only make him retreat further. Instead, I let my mind drift backward to the place where everything between us had begun. We met during freshman orientation at the University of Oregon. I arrived 20 minutes late after getting hopelessly lost trying to find the engineering building, even though I was majoring in interior design. Noah was sitting alone on the campus lawn with a campus map spread across his knees, looking just as confused as I felt. I remember asking if he knew where the student center was. He laughed and admitted he had been pretending to study the map for nearly half an hour because he was too embarrassed to ask anyone for directions. We spent the next 2 hours wandering around campus together, accidentally attending the wrong welcome session before finally finding the correct building. By the end of that day, we had exchanged phone numbers, shared our first terrible cafeteria lunch, and somehow agreed that getting lost together was more fun than pretending we knew where we were going. That strange beginning became the foundation of everything that followed. Throughout college, we were almost impossible to separate. We studied together, split rent on a tiny off-campus apartment for 2 years, celebrated birthdays with cheap pizza, and survived endless final exams fueled by coffee that tasted more like burnt water than anything else. Whenever life became overwhelming, Noah always knew how to make me laugh. He once drove 40 miles just to bring me my favorite blueberry pie after I failed an important design competition. Another time he stayed awake with me until sunrise helping build a presentation model that eventually won first place. Looking back now, I realized something that had escaped me all those years. Noah remembered everything about me. He remembered that I hated mushrooms, that I always drank coffee without sugar, that thunderstorms helped me sleep, that I secretly listened to old jazz records whenever I was stressed. He noticed details most people would never see. At the time, I thought that was simply what best friends did. Maybe I had never questioned it because I never wanted to. My thoughts were interrupted when Noah walked into the kitchen carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You look like you traveled back in time," he said with a small smile. "Maybe I did," I answered. "I was thinking about college." His expression softened immediately. "Those were good years. Do you remember the day we got lost on campus?" He laughed quietly. "I still have that folded campus map somewhere." "You kept it." "I keep more things than I should." The answer sounded ordinary, yet something in his voice carried a quiet weight. He glanced toward the hallway where his suitcase rested beside the small wooden box before quickly looking away again. It lasted only a second, but I caught it this time. Every memory we shared seemed to lead him back to that box, that old envelope, and whatever truth he had been carrying alone for all these years. For the first time, I began to wonder if our past had been the same story for both of us, or if Noah had been living inside an entirely different version while I never noticed. By the 5th day, the apartment had developed its own quiet rhythm, one that made it dangerously easy to forget Noah had only planned to stay for a week. We shared breakfast every morning, argued over which coffee shop roasted better beans, took evening walks after dinner, and settled into the kind of comfortable routine that usually took months to build. Yet every time I started believing things were finally becoming normal again, I noticed another small reminder that time was running out. Noah had begun packing little by little. It was never obvious enough to mention, but each afternoon another book disappeared into his suitcase, another camera lens found its place inside a padded case, another neatly folded shirt vanished from the dresser in the guest room. He was preparing to leave while pretending he was not. Friday arrived with bright blue skies after nearly a week of rain. I suggested we spend the afternoon downtown, visiting the weekend farmers market we used to love when we were younger. Noah agreed immediately. We wandered through rows of fresh flowers, homemade bread, local honey, and handmade pottery, stopping every few minutes because Noah wanted another photograph. He was not interested in the colorful displays or the musicians entertaining the crowd. Instead, he photographed ordinary moments. A father teaching his daughter how to choose apples. Two elderly friends laughing over fresh peaches. A couple sitting quietly on a park bench with paper cups of coffee. It was almost as though he believed the smallest moments deserved to be remembered the most. While we ate sandwiches from a food truck overlooking the river, I noticed him checking his watch for what felt like the 10th time that day. "Do you have somewhere you need to be?" I asked. He looked surprised before forcing an easy smile. "No, just keeping track of the days. You only have 2 more nights here," I said without thinking. The words hung between us longer than I expected. Noah lowered his eyes toward the river. I know. There was something about the way he answered that made my chest feel unexpectedly heavy. It sounded less like someone counting down to a departure and more like someone saying goodbye to something they wished could last forever. On the drive home, we listened to an old playlist from college. When one of our favorite songs came on, Noah quietly laughed and admitted he still remembered every word. We sang along badly, just like we always had, until the song ended. Then the silence returned. It no longer felt awkward. It felt unfinished. That evening, I ordered pizza from the neighborhood place we always used to visit after late study sessions. We spread the boxes across the coffee table, watched an old comedy neither of us was paying attention to, and laughed at scenes we had already memorized years ago. For a little while, I convinced myself I had imagined the distance growing between us. But after midnight, I walked into the kitchen for a glass of water and noticed a soft light coming from the guest room. The door was slightly open. Noah sat cross-legged on the floor with the small wooden box open in front of him for the first time. Inside were carefully stacked photographs, ticket stubs, pressed leaves, folded notes, and the faded envelope with my name written across it. He gently picked up one photograph, smiled through eyes filled with quiet emotion, then whispered words I barely managed to hear before he realized I was there. "Tomorrow," he said softly to himself. "Tomorrow, he finally deserves to know everything." Saturday arrived with a quiet stillness that made the apartment feel different before either of us spoke a single word. Noah was already awake, sitting on the balcony with a mug of coffee warming his hands as the early morning sun painted the rooftops in soft gold. I joined him without saying anything. We had reached the point where silence no longer needed to be filled. It simply existed between us, comfortable and fragile at the same time. After several minutes, Noah looked toward me with an expression I had never seen before. There was no hesitation left in it, only acceptance. "Would you come with me somewhere?" he asked. Of course. He drove us to the small hill overlooking the lake, where we had watched countless sunsets during college. The parking lot was nearly empty, and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine through the trees. We sat on the weathered wooden bench that somehow had survived all these years. Noah placed the familiar wooden box between us. For a long moment, he rested both hands on the lid without opening it. Then he took a slow breath and smiled sadly. "I have carried this box with me through 4 apartments, 3 different jobs, and more moving trucks than I can count," he said. "I kept telling myself I would leave it behind someday, but I never could." He carefully lifted the lid. Inside were photographs from college, movie ticket stubs, receipts from tiny diners we used to visit after midnight, pressed autumn leaves collected during weekend hikes, and dozens of neatly folded letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Everything inside belonged to moments I had almost forgotten. To Noah, they had never stopped matching. He picked up the oldest photograph. It showed the 2 of us standing in front of our freshman dorm, both laughing because someone had accidentally spilled coffee across the sidewalk seconds before the picture was taken. "You remember this day?" he asked. Of course. He nodded gently. That was the day I realized my life had just changed. Before I could respond, he handed me the bundle of letters. "Every one of these was written to you," he said quietly. My heart skipped. "You wrote all of these?" "Over the years. Whenever I wanted to tell you something, but could not find the courage." I untied the ribbon with careful hands. The first letter was dated nearly 8 years earlier. None of them had ever been opened because none of them had ever been given to me. Noah looked out across the lake while I held the stack in silence. I kept thinking there would be a perfect moment, he continued. After graduation, after my first job, after your promotions, after every excuse I could invent. But every time the moment came, I convinced myself that losing our friendship would hurt more than hiding the truth. He finally turned toward me, and for the first time all week, he did not look away. His voice remained calm, but every word carried years of quiet honesty. Ethan, I have loved you since we were 19 years old. Not for a few weeks. Not by accident. For almost our entire adult lives. I never expected you to feel the same. I only wanted you to know before I walked away, because I could not spend another year pretending that what I felt was only friendship. The breeze stirred the letters in my hands as the world around us became impossibly quiet. Suddenly, every unanswered question, every photograph, every ordinary moment he had treasured, and every silence we had shared finally became part of the same story. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. The stack of unopened letters rested in my hands, suddenly heavier than paper had any right to be. 8 years. 8 years of words I had never read, feelings I had never noticed, and moments I had mistaken for nothing more than friendship. I looked at Noah, searching for any sign that he might be joking, but there was only quiet honesty in his eyes. It was the same steady expression he had worn every time he encouraged me before an important presentation, every time he picked me up after my car broke down, every time he celebrated my successes as though they were his own. The difference was that now I finally understood why those moments had always seemed to carry a depth I could never quite explain. Carefully, I unfolded the first letter. The date in the corner brought me back to our sophomore year. The words were simple. Noah wrote about an afternoon we had spent studying at the library before walking across campus in the rain because neither of us had remembered an umbrella. He admitted that he wanted to reach for my hand that day, but chose instead to joke about the weather because he was afraid of changing everything between us. I opened another letter, then another. Each one described an ordinary memory that had quietly become extraordinary through his eyes. A late-night diner after finals. A birthday road trip to the coast. The day I accepted my first job. Every page revealed that while I believed we were collecting memories as best friends, Noah had been collecting them as someone deeply in love. I slowly lowered the letters into my lap and stared across the lake where the afternoon sunlight shimmered across the water. Suddenly, my own memories began rearranging themselves. I remembered how Noah always seemed happiest whenever I called unexpectedly, how he never forgot important dates that even I sometimes overlooked, how every apartment I rented somehow felt more like home after he visited. I remembered the disappointment I felt whenever he left, a feeling I had always explained away by telling myself that I simply missed my closest friend. But what if I had been giving the wrong name to the right emotion all along? I turned toward him. Why did you never tell me? I asked quietly. Noah smiled with the gentleness I had known for years. Because you were the most important person in my life. If I told you and you did not feel the same, I was afraid. I would lose the friendship that meant everything to me. Loving you from a distance felt easier than imagining a life without you in it. His answer broke something open inside me, not with pain, but with clarity. I realized that every relationship I had tried to build over the years had quietly fallen apart because I kept comparing people to someone I insisted was only my best friend. No one else ever made ordinary days feel meaningful. No one else ever understood me without explanations. No one else had ever felt like home. I laughed softly through the emotion rising in my chest and shook my head at myself. I think I have been just as blind as you have been afraid, I admitted. Noah looked at me, uncertain for the first time since we had arrived. What do you mean? I met his eyes and answered with complete honesty. I kept wondering why every goodbye with you hurt more than it should. I kept telling myself that was simply what lifelong friendship felt like. But sitting here now, hearing your truth, I finally understand something I should have realized years ago. I was never afraid of losing my best friend. I was afraid of losing the person I loved before I even knew that was what I was feeling. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The wind carried the scent of the lake through the trees while the unopened letters rested quietly between us. No longer symbols of hidden feelings, but proof that two people had spent years standing on opposite sides of the same truth. Noah lowered his eyes and smiled with quiet disbelief. I promised myself I would not expect anything after telling you. he said softly. I only wanted to stop hiding. I shook my head. And I spent years hiding without even realizing it. I laughed at the strange irony of it. You were afraid of losing our friendship, and I was so certain we were only friends that I never questioned why every goodbye with you felt impossible. Noah looked at me carefully, as though he was waiting for the moment I would change my mind. Instead, I reached over and gathered the letters into a neat stack before placing them gently back inside the wooden box. These do not belong hidden away anymore, I said. They belong to our story. His eyes filled with quiet emotion. You really mean that? I do. He let out a slow breath that sounded as though he had been holding it for years. We stayed on the bench until the afternoon sun began slipping lower across the water, talking more honestly than we ever had before. Noah told me about the opportunities he had turned down because they would have taken him too far away. He admitted that every birthday message, every unexpected phone call, every visit had been enough to keep hope alive, even when he believed nothing would ever change. I confessed that every apartment I moved into somehow felt incomplete until he came to visit, that every achievement seemed worth celebrating only after I heard his voice, and that I had never understood why no relationship ever felt as natural as simply spending an ordinary day with him. Looking back, the answers had always been there. We simply had not known how to read them. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Noah glanced at his watch one last time before smiling to himself. I was supposed to leave tomorrow morning, he admitted. I already booked the flight. The words landed gently, but they carried the weight of another decision waiting to be made. I looked at him and realized I no longer wanted to measure our future in departures. Then cancel it, I said without hesitation. He blinked. What? Cancel the flight. Stay. He searched my face as though he needed to be certain he had heard correctly. Ethan, you do not have to say that because of today. I am not saying it because of today. I am saying it because I finally understand every day that came before today. A quiet smile slowly spread across his face, brighter than any expression I had seen all week. He pulled out his phone, opened the airline application, and after one final glance at me, canceled the reservation. Neither of us celebrated with dramatic words or grand promises. Instead, we walked back toward the car side by side, talking about simple things like what we should cook for dinner and whether my guest room should remain a guest room much longer. For the first time since Noah arrived with his suitcase, the future no longer felt like a countdown. It felt like an open road neither of us had to travel alone, and somehow the ordinary life we had always shared suddenly became the beginning of something we had both been searching for all along. 1 year later, I found myself standing in the exact same spot on the balcony where Noah had quietly watched the sunrise during his first morning in my apartment. The difference was that the apartment no longer felt like mine alone. His camera rested on the bookshelf beside my design magazines. His favorite coffee beans occupied half the kitchen cabinet. A pair of running shoes sat neatly beside mine by the front door, no longer belonging to a guest, but to someone who had become part of every ordinary day. Looking back, it was difficult to believe everything had changed because of a single week that almost ended with another goodbye. The wooden box still sat in our living room, no longer hidden beneath a bed or tucked away inside a suitcase. We placed it on the bookshelf where sunlight reached it every afternoon. Sometimes we opened it together, laughing at old movie tickets, faded photographs, and handwritten notes that reminded us how many memories we had collected before either of us understood what they truly meant. The letters remained inside as well. I eventually read every one of them, not all at once, but slowly, one every few days, allowing each page to bring another forgotten moment back to life. Every letter showed me the same lesson from a different angle. Love had not appeared suddenly beside that lake. It had quietly grown through years of shared breakfasts, long drives, late-night conversations, small acts of kindness, and ordinary days that neither of us realized would become unforgettable. Noah still carried his camera almost everywhere we went. The only difference was that now he no longer photographed ordinary moments because he feared they would disappear. He photographed them because we both understood they were the moments that built a life. Saturday mornings became our tradition. We walked through the same farmer's market, bought fresh flowers for the apartment, argued playfully over which bakery made the best cinnamon rolls, and stopped at the same bench overlooking the river where we had once wondered whether our future would end with another farewell. Instead, Every week became another beginning. One evening, while organizing old boxes during spring cleaning, I found the folded campus map from our first day at the university. The edges were worn, and several corners had nearly fallen apart after so many years. Noah laughed the moment he saw it. "We were completely lost," he said. I smiled and shook my head. "Maybe not completely." He looked at me with quiet curiosity. "What do you mean?" I folded the map carefully and placed it inside the wooden box beside the letters. "We thought we were lost because we did not know where the buildings were. We just did not realize we had already found the person who would change our lives." Noah smiled, and in that familiar expression I recognized every version of him I had ever known. The nervous freshman pretending to understand a campus map, the loyal friend who never stopped believing in me, the patient man who carried years of unwritten goodbyes, and the person who finally trusted me with the truth. Sometimes people spend their lives searching for extraordinary love, believing it arrives with perfect timing and dramatic moments. Our story taught me something different. The strongest love can quietly begin inside ordinary days, growing so naturally that you mistake it for friendship until one honest conversation changes the meaning of every memory that came before it. And every time I glance at the wooden box resting peacefully on our shelf, I remember that the greatest chapter of my life did not begin with a grand gesture. It began with one simple request, 7 ordinary days, and the courage for two best friends to finally tell each other the truth.